Good afternoon. It's lovely to see you all here. Please take a seat. So this afternoon we're going to be talking about, can the commercial space race survive astropolitics? An expression I had not heard of before, astropolitics. I'm being educated. The space economy has quietly become one of the fastest growing sectors in the world, worth over 600 billion, with nearly 4/5 of it in private sector hands. But space isn't just another market. It sits at the intersection of national ambition, commercial innovation, and geopolitical competition, what some are calling the new astropolitics. As space becomes more commercially viable, can private enterprise remain independent, or will it inevitably be pulled back into the gravitational field, pun intended, of state power? How can governments harness and advance their space economy while keeping it out of the constraints of our current geopolitics and power politics? How can the commercial industry manage these tensions and continue to thrive? What does the future look like? We have three fantastic speakers with us today. David Avino, the CEO and founder of Argotec. Next to him, Emiliano, I'm not even going to try, apologies, Kargieman.
Very good.
The CEO and founder of Satellogic, and beside him, Volodymyr Levykin, CEO and founder of Skyrora. Apologies for my pronunciation. David, I want to start with you. You've suggested that the future is a continued transition from government-led to commercially led. And of course, you own your own company. It's a private enterprise. What is needed for this transition, and what's going to get in the way?
Yeah, let me give you shared really good numbers. Let me share a little bit of a few more figures. The Space Foundation is talking about in 2032 about 1 trillion, and right after 3 years, 1 trillion 800 billions. So we're talking about huge, really important numbers for the future. There are two different investments. So we usually in the space business, we talk about infrastructures, so the space segment and the ground segment. So those infrastructure up there in space, they are really expensive. So our business is very expensive, I can say. We require investments. Just another number I wanna give it to you, since we are in an economic forum. It's about investments in 2024. They were 25% more the year before. So this is another important statement to know, an analysis to know. So stating this, a single company, a joint venture between different companies, a collaboration between different investors might not be useful, but might not be enough for building up new infrastructures. Even more because every time we are talking about space, space means dual applications, commercial, defense, and so most of the time the government has to support the investments. So the balance, I can say, there is no recipe for this, I can say. When I started in my company, I thought that would have been already in 2020, this transition, but this has been delayed a little bit. You know why? Even more now, because the geopolitical situation changed a lot in the past few years, and we know very well.
So we're going to come back to that, which is how do we manage a space economy in a really volatile geopolitical space? This is the new arena. But Emiliano, I want to bring you in, if I may. How do we stop just picking up on what David's saying? How do we actually prevent space being the next kind of global competition arena? Can we?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So maybe I'd take a step back first. I think there's this tension, how we think about astropolitics, there's this tension between kind of the real politics side, which is about control, which is about, occupation of space, and the kind of idealistic side, which is around thinking space as a commons and, and how we create the rules to operate in these commons. I think there's a pendulum here that's been back and forth. The undercurrent today is obviously the rules-based world that we have lived in for the last 50 years is moving into a more transactional, deal-making world these days, right? I think the same undercurrent exists in astropolitics, which is, in a sense, geopolitics with the addition of, space. Space is essentially this big ocean that every nation on Earth has a border with, right? So it kind of changes the topology of geopolitics from that perspective. But if you think about this pendulum, at the beginning of the space era, from Sputnik roughly to the end of Apollo, it was a real politics world, right? It was about getting first to the moon. It was about showing supremacy, right? Then I guess from the Moon Treaty and the ITU and the years that follow, let's say 1975 until the Ukraine war, I think we lived kind of the rules-based world of astropolitics, right? And I think commercial companies flourished in this era, right? Now the pendulum is swinging back towards real politics. I think the biggest, probably if I have to say one event that, that is kind of the example of this was when Elon decided to shut down Starlink service over Ukraine.
Yeah.
And basically every nation in the world said, well, first of all, it's clear that all space infrastructure is dual use. And second, we can't really rely on, infrastructure that we don't own. And that's kind of been pushing, the idea of sovereignty and local supply chains and friend source sourcing. And, I think that's kind of where we are today.
So that's where I want to dig in. I want to bring Volodymyr into the conversation, but I want to dig into what are the consequences of that if space becomes the next arena for geopolitical power politics? What does that mean for commercial enterprises? What does that mean for innovation, efficiency, all of those wonderful things? But Volodymyr, let me come to you, because I think one of the dangers that we always have in conversations like this is we assume straight line trajectories. That's the way physiologically our brains work. We assume that what happened yesterday is going to happen tomorrow. And yet, in some of the frontiers of innovation, that is clearly not the case. Right? In the AI space, it is clearly not the case to say what happened yesterday, we're going to keep on the same kind of trajectory. I interviewed Elon Musk some years ago, and he was talking about logarithmic curves of progression, right, of innovation. So before we get into how do we manage the now, I want to make sure we're looking ahead. So what is the next big disruption from your perspective in the space industry? What's going to take us out of the straight line progression?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So first of all, there are a number of areas, right? And obviously, the topic of this conference is AI, right? AI will have a serious impact on space, especially Earth observation services, right? But I will let the other people to speak about it. Let's say, I would like to focus on the elephant in the room, which is, I believe, the next big step forward, is there so-called direct-to-device services, which start to emerge, which is basically mean when the satellites will be able to send the internet, whatever connectivity, to your mobile phone directly, which then will allow our industry, which is the new space, operate on completely new area, which is telco market, which is multi-trillion market, much bigger than us, right? And the Elon Musk, which you mentioned, is declared this, right? We're on this race right now, and obviously SpaceX is the most equipped because the Starship program, which is capable to bring crazy amount of payload on orbit, is exactly what's done for this purpose. And what makes this disruptive, especially for the telcos, when the telcos need to upgrade their mobile network, for example, from 5G to 6G, they require years to upgrade every single modem station, ground station, and so on. While this new space would be able to upgrade the whole network and move from, let's say, 6G to 7G just with a few Starship launchers. So that, I believe, the biggest disruptive innovation which we are...
So just to be clear, you're talking about the kind of speed of innovation being faster because you don't have to replace all of this kind of solid infrastructure. But presumably, so is it a software change that you're talking about? Because if these satellites are up in space, then...
yeah, you're also right that some of those could be changes of the software, but what I'm talking about, when the new space will step into the telecom business, right?
Okay.
Then the same transition, right, to upgrade the whole network globally. Imagine like moving from 4G to 5G took about 5 years, right? For every single, millions and millions workstation and millions of people be involved in this network upgrade around the globe. While the new space, I'm talking about Starlink, for example, right, or new generation direct-to-device services, will be able to upgrade the whole network by just upgrading the constellation of the satellites, which is relatively very much simple, especially if you have such large vehicles like Starship.
So if we think about the impact of mobile telephony in the global south as kind of leapfrogging the hard infrastructure that we did, you're talking about that on steroids, right? You're talking about the kind of the speed of change, the transformation, the disruption. Phenomenal. Go ahead.
I want to come back to your statement. Actually, it was right.
Okay.
About the software. You know why? Because in the past years, we were building new satellites every time we had to have new telecommunication or new activities. Mm-hmm. Now the satellites are becoming more software-based. You know why? First of all, because before we had to wait a lot of time before qualifying the components that we have in our satellites. Now the qualification is going to be more straight. And so this means that every time we have a new software to be uploaded on our satellites, maybe they are capable of managing those software. They have more computational capabilities. And at the same time, if we don't have computational capabilities, we're going to replace those satellites because the launch costs decreased a lot thanks to Elon Musk and other providers. So the software is going to be the key. Is already the key here on Earth. It's going to be even more the key for satellites.
I think I wanted to maybe building on some of what my companion said. I maybe want to bring us back to the astropolitics conversation.
Please.
I think, there's if you look at the kind of the distance between Sputnik and Starlink, right? It's kind of the distance between the telegraph and the internet in a sense, right? Like the advance is huge. And what you're talking about here, at the next stage is basically the way that commercial industry has driven innovation in space. It's shown by that, particularly if you compare it to the distance between the Apollo program and the Artemis program, right? Which are, you would say, the distance between a horse carriage and a larger horse carriage, right? Like there's really not a big change there. But what's very interesting, and so the underlying question, I guess, is if the pendulum is swinging back towards real politics and astropolitics, towards states being the driver for innovation, toward close down innovation instead of open innovation.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? What does that mean for, for the growth of space technology? What does that mean for the commons? I think there's positive and negative aspects. I will, probably just open the conversation here to you guys. But one of the positive aspects of this is government and defense are a great anchor tenant, and they're willing to fund, research, and they're willing to fund technology that is very hard to fund otherwise, right? And this is obviously great. We wouldn't have been able to build Starlink if we didn't have 40 years of government defense investment in space technology before, right? Now, obviously, it seems like the innovation transition to the commercial space and flourished extremely fast from 2010 to 2025, right? But of course, it's built on top, of gigantic investments done behind closed doors, let's say, for tens of years. So I think there's probably something like this is probably about to happen in the current scenario, where there's going to be tons of innovation funded by government and defense behind, small groups or clubs. But for this innovation to reach the global and for this to be available to all, I think maybe another pendulum swing.
So you're essentially saying original, 60, 70 years ago, it was funded mostly by governments. They were the kind of driving force. The commercial sector then has taken over and done a fantastic job, and now we're moving back to an area of principally government funded. Is that what it's going to look like? Is it government funded, or is it public-private in the sense that, you talk about, in the territorial defense space, we look at what's happening in Ukraine and we say, oh, there's an enormous amount of innovation, and that's happening driven by the need on the ground, but it's also being driven by commercial entities, right? So how's that balance? Maybe, to David and Volodymyr, how do you see it changing?
So I'm not expecting too much changes in terms of the government support, right? So
okay.
I think that the main countries already made their bet, right? Don't forget that SpaceX received from the US government in different estimation from 10 to 38 billion, let's say, support in terms of the contracts and other forms, right? So we are the British company, so we kind of get not to rely on the government, because that help would arrive simply because UK cannot afford this, same amount of support which the US can.
Yeah.
So that's why I wish that it was government support, but realistically we should rely only on ourselves and trying to do this, the roadmaps, potentially side of products to basically start to generate revenue, build a sustainable business, right, which then will help to fund the in our case, rocket
So for
program.
you, it's very much commercially driven. David?
Yeah, no.
I know you work in the...
Of course, we work in different environments also with the Italian government and different governments. We're busy in US as well. So I think it's important to know the partnership, the public and private partnership is going to be still very important. Maybe it's going to change a little bit the model. So it's almost the same happened already in US. So the government they're gonna pay not the entire infrastructure, but maybe they're gonna pay upfront the service. Mm-hmm. And so the private they're gonna build the infrastructure, having already on one hand the contracts signed for the services to be provided as soon as the infrastructure will be operational. So this is a model that I think is gonna work. It's completely different if we're talking about defense. Defense is completely different because of course the defense applications, they wanted to own the infrastructure most of the time. They wanted to own the data. They wanted to own their control service.
Yeah.
They need to be very tied into.
And how is... So, let's talk a little bit for a moment about what's happening here on Earth and the kind of fracturing of politics. And how is that? How is the... What's the impact of that having on your supply chains? What's the impact of that on your ability to do business? Because back in the world when everybody was, I'm exaggerating, but people were collaborative, right? And you could cross borders without problems. That is no longer the case, or not becoming so. So how's what's happening here on Earth affecting your ability to...
Yeah, there's obviously been a big change, at least on a narrative from commercial companies building global infrastructure to commercial companies helping build sovereign capabilities, right?
Yeah.
I think that's, the first order effect. So you go, Europe is thinking about how they build their own Starlink, right? How they build their own Starship, right? Like, this is clearly not something that was on the minds of anybody 6 years ago, right, or 8 years ago. And I think this is the first order effect, is you're going to go towards, friend sourcing or small clubs where, there's going to be a lot of effort in duplicating supply chains locally, right?
So it's going to be inefficient.
A lot of investment. So that's very inefficient,
yeah,
right, for a lot of reasons. It's obviously efficient from the point of view of sovereign capabilities and from the point of view of resilience against, the type of world that we're walking into, but it's clearly more inefficient from the point of view of how we invest dollars and how we transform that into infrastructure for the benefit of all. So I think that's kind of the counterpart to, the good side, which is, okay, investment in defense, it's a big driver for innovation, but obviously part of that investment is going to go into replicating things locally that,
So there's more money,
in.
but that money is being used less efficiently, and it's more costly because you're having to buy local rather than that.
And correct. And there are limitations to scale, right? Like, whereas once you could say, we're going to build this and everybody in the world is going to use it, now you basically have to say, okay, where are we going to build this?
Yeah.
And based on where we're going to build this, we kind of try to figure out who's going to be able to use it, right? Which, obviously for, kind of, we used to think about many space technologies and a lot of space infrastructure as winner takes all place, right? Where you would build something like Starlink and you would say, well, once you build that, nobody else has really an incentive to go and do the same thing, right?
It's like GPS and Galileo, right?
Right. That's no longer the case, right? And I think that's, interesting, at least.
Go on.
And even more for all these changes from geopolitical standpoint, I think is forcing governments to avoid that there is just one provider for that kind of service, because otherwise, he was mentioning Starlink for Ukraine.
Yeah.
You know what happened?
You're held hostage.
That's right. And you don't want to be hostage anymore from just one provider.
Or one individual.
Yeah, I would say that talking from the rocket's perspective, right? So there is no change. So it was, regardless of the globalization era which we used to live, right? It was never the case for the rocket. It was always regulated, controlled, and to do use and such. So that's why, we get used to such kind of restrictions. We respect them. We understand their purpose. We understand that we are the subject of national interest. It's great that there are written rules. So that is where you can play and you can work around this, not work around, but according to the rules, right? That is great. So from one perspective, we quite admire this situation, because we never experienced anything different.
So you're used to it. You've built a business around the fact that you've got the rules in place.
Yeah, that's just given,
Which leads nicely on to a slightly different question, which is who's going to write the rules of space, right? So if we're operating in the military sense here in territorially or in the maritime space, you've got EEZs, right, around the borders of countries that you have responsibility of your area of seas around your countries, and then you've got international rules for the other parts of the seas. Does that exist in space? And if it doesn't exist in space, who's going to write those rules? We're looking at a ineffective UN. Is there any chance that we're going to have a common assessment?
There are, again, historically we had some base rules. I think the Moon Treaty of 1967 is probably the biggest example. But that is changing, right? A few years ago, I think Luxembourg was the first country to issue some laws suggesting that private individuals and private companies could own things in space. The US followed very quickly with similar set of rules. So there is, in a sense, a transition towards a more mercantilistic view of space. And I think that's going to have to play out before the pendulum swings back towards rules-based. I find interesting the question of what would make the pendulum swing back, right?
Okay.
What needs to happen for the world to decide suddenly that we need a set of rules to work in space? And I think we're not there yet.
Italy also approved a few months ago the space law, so it's a good starting point, I can say. The European government is working on the Space Act as well. But the main issue that there is no law that is, in a certain way, implying all the actors, all the countries to work on.
Yeah.
What I mean, that I don't think there are some nations that will never apply those rules that the Europeans or the EU is going to sign, or Italy, or maybe Luxembourg or other countries. This is going to create a lot of issues, I can say. Just an example for the space debris. If the European Parliament, through the Space Act, they're going to impose a lot of rules to the European industries, this is going to be an issue from a competition point of view towards other countries that are not respecting those rules.
So you're essentially saying what's happening territorially is now happening up there.
Yeah, I would like to just add a bit, right? So there are the rules on the ground, which is basically regulate the launch itself, right? Which we completely respect, and the government should define the red lines about the safety, national security interests, right, and spectrum allocations, right, and then the industry should develop the standards, which it does right now, standards how to achieve and how to scale within these rules, which is common sense ones, to achieve the launch itself. As for the, it's getting quite interesting, even when every single launch, imagine that the rocket flies over the foreign territories.
Yeah.
Even the launch. We are not at space yet, but we are already the subject of a number of different jurisdictions, which is the process when we are getting licenses. The government, British government, help us a lot to get this sorted with a number of different nations. Then we're on orbit, and then we also may collide other satellites. Everything must be balanced. The spectrum, the frequencies which satellites operate on can block each other and so on. So there is right now a good, healthy international agreements and law as it is right now. And so far it was all right and decent and reasonable when all the parts, including the big players, were respecting these international laws. It may change.
It
right?
may change. So I'm going to come back. I want to come to the audience. There's a poll that we're going to put up. Please take a look at take your cameras out. The question that we're asking you is, who will ultimately dominate the space economy? Is it governments or is it corporates? So where are we on that volatile spectrum that you discussed? As people are answering that, I have a question because we've got quite a number of Europeans here. Just to close, does Europe have a chance of competing against China, against the United States from a commercial perspective? Do we have the resources? How's that going to play out? Because again, if I'm taking geopolitics and putting it in space.
From a technical standpoint, yes. Of course, we do have technologies. We do have different companies, large companies, small companies. We can go through all the activities required in space. From an economic standpoint, I think Europe has to invest more.
Yeah.
Because we are just fundraising right now as a company, and compared, of course, to the capital market in US is completely different. Mm-hmm. And since our business is capital intensive, we require more investments from EU.
Okay, so we need to do more.
I think the definition of foolishness is doing the same thing and expecting different results, right? And if you look at Europe, I think continues to focus on regulation. The fusion between Leonardo and Thales and Airbus, I think is a clear example that Europe has not learned its lessons and has its act together. And so the future is not written, but if you have to guess from where we are today, I would say no chance.
So not enough money, too regulatory. Volodymyr, you're based in the UK.
Yes, but let's assume that I'm based in Europe, right? So
okay.
Because actually in aerospace, we have European Space Program agency, which is UK is still the part of, right? So I believe that jointly combined for sure, right? Europe can compete and will compete and competing with space. If not Europe, then who? We have skills, we have experience, we have legacy, right? We have finance jointly combined. So that's what we do.
So we can. So we haven't talked about talent. We haven't had enough time to talk about talent, but the takeaway from this conversation for me is we do have potential massive disruptions coming, but we should also anticipate that whatever's happening on the ground territorially is also playing out in space. And maybe there's a bit of a lag time, but it's not long. So one word each, literally one word each. If you could snap your fingers and make one change, what would it be?
Bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy.
I think there's an alignment around the idea that the Earth has finite resources and there's infinite resources for us out there.
Think infinite. We need to look elsewhere.
Industry-wise, breakthrough in return of investments as an industry.
Okay. Breaks the rules, joint investments.
Break through and get the high return of investments which already been spent as an industry at all.
Okay.
Overall.
Collaboration, I'm taking that one. So we have our governments and corporations. The good news is corporations for the people on the panel. Thank you so much for joining me. Will you join me in thanking our panelists, please? Thank you.